Welcome, everyone, to another lesson in introductory philosophy. This one is called Decoding Materialism. And this one is going to be essentially part two of a lesson called The Mind Body Problem. It is basically the flip side. In the first lesson in this series, we looked at arguments for and against substance dualism. In this lesson, what we're going to do is look at the flip side of things. We're going to look at arguments. Well, we're essentially going to explore materialism and see whether or not it stands up to scrutiny. So I imagine this is what your notes look like. This is me in a very delusional mode where I imagine that your notes look exactly like mine. So let's just review real quick the different concepts we're covering. Materialism is, as I defined it last time, the view that the only things that exist are things that occupy space, compounds whose existence depends on things that occupy space, and the void. In other words, it's atoms, compounds made up of atoms, and the void, which is that space in which all these different compounds interact with each other, all these different atoms exist. Well, that's pretty straightforward. I think by this point, it is a very materialistic, well, actually, that is the name of the view, right? I shouldn't say that. It is highly compatible with different ideas that give you a real flavor of what this view is about. It is compatible with atheism. It is actually very much often correlated with it, as well as naturalism, the view that the only valid explanations of natural phenomena are natural explanations. Nothing non natural, nothing that is non physical counts in these explanations. Only the void, which is basically this vacuum uh, in which all these other material things interact with each other. Most important for our purposes is that for a materialist, mental states and minds are simply the product of material brains. Substance dualism, to recap, is basically the rejection of materialism. There are minds, and they are actually non physical. Minds are not merely the products of brains, minds are non physical souls. Now, typically, this also includes the belief that these souls are eternal, right? They're not going to die anytime soon. And, we don't need to get into that, but the basic gist here is that we do have non physical souls that will continue to exist once our bodies have died and decomposed and such. Cool. So, real quick, there is a sidebar here. I actually have two sidebars, I believe, in this lesson. Lots of people, kind of think that this view is a Western invention, materialism. Not so, my friends. It has cropped up maybe independently, or maybe there's a link between these two views. I won't get into that here, but basically, we also see this in Eastern philosophy, in the Lokayana school of thought in ancient India. I'm almost positive that I mispronounced that, so save the comments. I don't need them. But the general idea here is that it does seem to be the case that this view does pop up in at least two different thought traditions. I wouldn't be surprised if it pops up in other places. I just don't know about it. So this is not a Western thing. This is a, fairly reliable line of thinking that just pops up here and there. Okay. Here's what I want to do today, and it's kind of weird. And if in the middle of it you're a little bit confused, like it's okay because that's sort of the point of today's lesson. The point is to explore materialism and kind of ride that train as far as we can take us and just see what happens. And spoiler, uh, the train kind of crashes at some point. Now, I want you to, don't worry, I will give you the point of the lesson once more at the very end. But I just want you to, think with me here, right? Just follow this line of reasoning. I'm going to give you one very prominent view on how it is that the mind works, how materialism operates at the level of consciousness, the materialist explanation of consciousness. I will give you two views and just, Think with me. Let's see how this goes. The first one is a very famous one. It's from the 20th century. It's called behaviorism. Let me give you a very broad definition of what behaviorism is, then I'll kind of get a little more granular. I will go in some pretty, heavy detail on this view because that's sort of the point. I want you to see the actual nuts and bolts of a materialist theory to see if it works, to see if it survives, critical analysis. All right, so here we go. Behaviorism is an umbrella term for a family of views that claim that either mental states don't exist or they might as well not exist since they cannot be studied directly. So instead, we should focus on behavioral dispositions. Okay, so if I had to, put this into, very maybe even oversimplistic terms here, behaviorism is basically this. Let's not look inside the brain too much. It just doesn't help. Maybe there's nothing in there, right? Nothing that really matters. There's nothing called mental states. Either way, even if there is something in there called mental state, what we should really focus on is external behaviors and the environment. What we do in the certain situations that we find ourselves in. That's really all that matters. Just keep track of that, and if you can figure out, everything that matters about humans. Okay, let's take a second here and get slightly more granular. It turns out that if you get into philosophy of psychology, there's actually quite a few brands of behaviorism. I won't get into any of them, but one. I want to focus on just the most radical form of behaviorism, which is known as radical behaviorism, or sometimes just psychological behaviorism. But this is a view that behavior can be described and explained without making ultimate reference to mental events or to internal psychological processes. The sources of behavior are external in the environment, not internal in the mind or in the head. I happen to think this is the most well, I mean, you'll see the people that are prominent behaviorists, and this is the kind of behaviorism that they advocated. So it is the most representative of that movement known as behaviorism. That's more or less the main message that I want to communicate. That's why I'm focusing on it. Okay. Put more bluntly, in case you need it, the interior architecture of an organism is irrelevant. All that matters are the carrots and sticks that direct the organism's behavior. So look at the maze we put people in and look at their behavior. And that's all you need to learn about what's going on with the human, with the person in question, the organism in question. You don't need to know what's going on inside the brain. Not only can we not study it, so it doesn't really matter, but even if we could study it, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to look in there at mental states to figure out humans. That's the gist. By the way, I told you that there's, very prominent people in this camp. I bet you've heard of this person, B.F. Skinner, probably the most famous advocate of this kind of radical behaviorism. There are others, like his teacher. Let me give you a little story time here. Behaviorists believe that the appropriate rewards and punishments will determine the behavior of any organism, be it pigeons, rats, or humans. Okay, so basically, you can, with the appropriate set of rewards or punishments, shape anything at all, any organism, any living organism, into whatever it is that you wanted to shape it into, right? Whatever you want to make of it. I do. I don't know. I'm not sure that "like" is the right word, but I am fascinated by these experiments by B.F. Skinner to train pigeons to, kind of steer bombs during World War II. So the idea is that he would train pigeons in a certain way to kind of peck in the right direction, and it would actually be like a smart bomb, right? The pigeons would be falling along with the bomb, and it would kind of poke it in the direction that they want it to drop, all the way down to the ground, right? And so that's better because in these days you couldn't actually guide these bombs very clearly. So if you wanted more precision in your bombings, well, pigeons were going to be the solution. That's why I said like isn't the right word, but kind of fascinating that that's what he was working on. Rats, the same thing. You can train them to solve mazes very quickly if you have the right set of I don't know what kind of treats rats like, but just those kind of rewards. Humans, same thing. This is B.F. Skinner's teacher, John Watson, and he used to boast that you just give him free reign, right? Give him a baby, an infant, and let him do whatever he wants. And given the right environmental manipulations, he can turn that infant into an artist, a merchant, a beggar, a thief, whatever you want. All you have to do is give him full control and all the resources that he would need to train this kid, and he can make him, whatever kind of person that he wants him to be. So that is pretty radical. I hope you can see there. And yeah, it doesn't matter what's inside the brain, right? Mental states are irrelevant. All you need is a certain environment, and you will create certain behaviors. Clearly, the behaviorists accepted the blank slate hypothesis as advocated by John Locke. Behaviorists also assumed the universality of humans and admitted of no variation between them. So we all come with the same gear. It is blank when we are born, and the environment is what habituates us into performing certain behaviors. So that's why some people act in one way. It's all the environment they were born in, and other people act differently. It's a different environment. That's what it was. Okay. Various experiments and theoretical problems with behaviorism eventually force the view out of favor. I'm telling you the spoiler ahead of time, right? I'm telling you this view has been by and large abandoned, at least in psychology. Um, now, that is the point of the lesson. A materialist line of thinking comes into prominence, right? It gets popular for a little bit, and then there's all these problems, and it falls out of favor. We're going to see this, just twice at least in this lesson, maybe three times. I don't know. Um, Let me tell you now about some of those problems. So they started in the 60s, and one of them is by Harry Harlow. Harry Harlow's experiments with rhesus monkeys showed that these monkeys preferred a cuddling mother, in quotes, over a feeding mother, in quotes, no matter how much conditioning they received. What Harry Harlow did to a bunch of rhesus monkeys is essentially torture, but he put them into cages where there was a warm, cuddly mother that had a little heater in her. It's basically just a wire mesh with a little heater and I guess a little blanket to make it cuddly. That's one mother. And the other mother is just like a feeding mother, one that has a bottle attached to her. And basically, he would starve the monkeys and see, if he can get them to go to the feeding mother. But no, they generally liked the cuddling mother, the warm, cuddly mother more, no matter what they did, no matter how they trained them. And so that shows you and anyone who ever reads about this that A, Harry Harlow would have never gotten his experiments approved by modern ethics boards, but B, and probably more relevant to our lesson, is that there is a predisposition in rhesus monkeys, at least, to go for a certain kind of mother, a certain kind of behavior. That means it's built in. It was in there from the start. It was not a blank slate, and there's no degree of environmental manipulations that you can invent that will get that out of that rhesus monkey. And so that looks bad for behaviorists. They were saying, hey, give us the environment, we'll make the behavior happen. Looks like it doesn't happen that way. So there is one example. Here is another one that's actually a few years prior to Harlow's experiments, but a lot less famous for whatever reason. John Garcia, no relation whatsoever to me, was unable to condition rats to not drink a substance if it didn't smell bad. In other words, so basically, he would give rats um, substances that smelled good but were bad for them. They would give them diarrhea or whatever, nausea. And Garcia could not get the rats to not drink it unless it smelled bad, right? So that suggests that rats are predisposed to trust their sense of smell over any conditioning. Let me put this in other language. It doesn't matter how much training you try to impart on these rats, they come in with a built in rule: only don't drink things that smell bad. It doesn't matter what you make those, nice smelling things do to them, they will never learn to not drink it. This, by the way, is called the Garcia effect, and I wish something would one day get named after me. No luck yet. All right. It's also the case that Noam Chomsky, who had a theory about universal grammar, challenged the behaviorists in a very forceful way. Actually, Chomsky usually gets most of the credit for dethroning behaviorism. He probably gets a little bit too much credit. Not that he's not important, but it was all kinds of experiments that were looking bad for behaviorism. Chomsky argued that we have something called a language instinct, or a language behavior, language acquisition mechanism. And well, if that's the case, then we aren't born with a blank slate, right? There is something in there when we are born. And so that is yet another strike against behaviorism. And so, for all these reasons, it looks like behaviorism fell out of favor. A materialist theory about how it is that consciousness in the mind works failed. They were going for a while, going strong, and eventually it fell apart. That's the point. Actually, that's an example. The main point here is that materialism has failed in the past. People were saying, hey, we got it, and they were not right about that. Let me give you a quick sidebar. This is my second sidebar of the lesson. And it's basically this: the camp that really began to attack behaviorism, eventually, they would gain prominence, they would become more popular, and eventually they would also lose favor, right? So this is, just a recurring theme that we get in the history of psychology. Let me tell you about this movement. It's called connectionism. And here's what I'll say. In chapter 17 of his Deep Learning Revolution, Sejnowski tells the story of how learning research was actually hampered by Chomsky's 1971 critique of behaviorism. This is because Chomsky made the case that the human brain couldn't generalize, but he was wrong. So let me say a couple of things here. First of all, Chomsky, he had his own views, right? And they, became very popular after behaviorism started to wane. And by the way, Chomsky's views, although helpful for a while, in the long run were shown to be unhelpful, right? At least in some areas. I guess I can explain what was going on here. What Chomsky argued against the behaviorists is that sometimes we recognize sentences that aren't in a structure that we've seen before. So, according to the behaviorists, we should only recognize things that we've seen before, sentences that we've heard before. And Chomsky said, no, sometimes we recognize sentences and we, intuit the meaning of these sentences, even though we've never been exposed to them in the past. And that's supposed to be a strike against behaviorism, because behaviorists say that we become accustomed to certain stimuli by being exposed to them. So why would we be able to recognize sentences that we've never been exposed to? Okay, this sounds really bad for the behaviorists. They actually responded. They said, hey, you know what? These sentences that you've never been exposed to, they sound similar to sentences you have been exposed to. So, because the brain can generalize, that's how it is that we can recognize these sentences that we've never been exposed to. They're close enough to sentences that we have heard before. But Chomsky said, I don't know how the human brain could generalize. And some people bought it. And so they just figured that the brain couldn't generalize. It wasn't until the connectionist movement came in, by the way, if you don't know about the connectionist movement. It has to do with something called neural networks, and you've probably heard of that before. I won't get into it here, but the connectionists did figure out how it is that we generalize. And so let me summarize it this way: the behaviorists said one thing and they were wrong, and the people that proved the behaviorists wrong said another thing and they were wrong. And then the connectionists who showed that Chomsky was wrong, well, they're getting pushed out as we speak. I mean, this is a battle that's going on right now. I can't say too much about it, but there's new things coming down the pike. So maybe they will eventually get replaced or fixed up, adapted. Right? It's not that their view as a whole is accurate. Okay. Let me keep going here with some of the attacks on behaviorism. In chapter 9 of his How We Learn, Dion, he is French, that's why you pronounce it that way, corrects some behaviorist assumptions about association. In particular, Dion makes a case that learning is not passive but active. The brain creates predictive models and it learns when its expectations are violated. In other words, we learn when we are surprised. Error feedback is required for learning. So the behaviorist basically thought that if you just, you know, get exposed to a bunch of things in the environment, you will, passively learn them. But now we know that the way we learn is much more proactive. We are essentially making simulations of our reality in our brains, and then we, you know, move through the world with these simulations in our brains. And whenever something is, a mismatch with our mental simulation, we are surprised. And then that's when we have to adapt our mental simulation. And that's how we learn. So basically, it is actually very active, our learning is. We are constantly checking that our model of reality actually matches reality itself. Constantly, constantly, every day, every moment, right? And so this is how wrong the behaviorists were. It is much more active than they gave our brain credit for, I suppose. Mental states are always in there, right? You can't just ignore them like they wanted to. Okay, all of that, my friends, was to talk about how behaviorism, although at one point very, 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 very popular, fell by the wayside eventually. Okay, will this happen again? Probably. How would we know when we finally get that one theory about how the mind works? How will we know for sure that it is accurate? Okay, let me go through the second view that we're going to cover today, the other one that also eventually fails. I will be much quicker with this one because you've already kind of seen the structure, and I could go, into way more detail with this, but you already know how it goes. A theory is prominent for a little while, and then it's not. So, identity theory, sometimes called mind-brain identity theory, that's the complete name, I suppose, is the view that mental states are brain states. So that probably sounds like gobbledygook. So I'm actually going to just, give you a nice little story about Daniel Dennett and the biologist Francis Crick. So Dennett, was really grilling Crick about whether Crick really believed in the identity theory. And so Dennett says to him, so you're saying that if we were to get a piece of brain in a petri dish, by the way, that's a petri dish there on the right, if you don't know what those look like. If you were to get a piece of brain and sort of like stimulated it in the way that a regular alive brain is stimulated when it sees the color red, you're saying, Crick, that piece of brain is literally the experience of red. Let me say that one more time, maybe hopefully a little bit clearer. For the mind brain identity theorist, what is the experience of seeing red? Like, what's going on in our brains when we see the color red? Well, for Crick and for other identity theorists, they're basically saying that if you want to know what the mental state of seeing red is, I'll show it to you. Here is a brain experiencing red. Whatever is going on with the brain, that is what seeing red is. In other words, if you were to take a piece of brain and make it do what happens in regular brains when they see red, that is seeing red. That brain currently is the mental state of seeing red. So, in that little petri dish, if we're stimulating it in the right way, that would be the mental state of seeing red. If this sounds confusing to you, it's because maybe the view is so crazy that that's why it sounds weird to you. Literally, what is it to see red? Look inside that petri dish. That's what it is to see red. That's what the mind brain identity theorists are saying. And so we've already kind of seen this view before in a way. If you remember this argument right here, the correlation and dependence argument, this was put forward. This was put forward by a mind brain identity theorist, right? So it has that flavor to it. In any case, it is no longer that popular. Donald Hoffman, who is a cognitive scientist, I think he's over at UCI. I might be wrong about that. But Hoffman just straight out says it's a silly view. It's just, not true, basically. Here is a quote from Hoffman, who has a view about how the mind is like an interface. I won't get into that here, but here's a quote where he is basically deriding the mind brain identity theory. Like a rock, we have bona fide physical properties. But unlike a rock, we have conscious experiences and propositional attitudes. Are these also physical, like the identity theorist claims? If so, it's not obvious. What is the mass of dizziness, the velocity of a headache, or the position of the wonder why Chris won't call? In each case, the question itself seems to harbor confusion and to mismatch categories. Dizziness is not the kind of thing that can be weighed on a scale. A wonder has no spatial coordinates. A headache can't be clocked with a radar gun. What Hoffman is saying is that dizziness, which is a mental state, can't be a piece of brain activated in a particular way. Because you can't weigh dizziness, but you can weigh that piece of brain, right? Wonder, whenever you wonder something, you can't really locate it like you can locate certain neurons inside of a brain. A headache, you can't see how fast it's moving, right? That's not that would be sometimes this is called a category error, but you can't see how fast it's moving. A headache doesn't move according to a speed, right? So, but a piece of brain does, right? A piece of brain, you can find a particular piece of it. You can see how fast it's moving. You can weigh it. None of those things are possible with mental states. And so this whole identification of mental states and brain states is kind of, doesn't survive the smell test. Okay, what is the point of all that? I will recap in a little bit. I wanted to just give you some more, conventional critiques of materialism, the way that we've been covering it. So, you know, two materialist views have failed, right? Identity theory, behaviorism. And materialism in general just doesn't seem to match up with our current physics. So let me give you these two more conventional objections to materialism. If you've never heard of relativity theory, I'm certainly not the person to explain it to you. Let me put it this way, maybe, and you can see it really in this image. It's that we used to think that space was just a void, right? It was just the space in which atoms interacted with each other. That is not true, my friends. Relativity theory shows us, or tells us, establishes for us that space curves, it flexes, it expands, it twists, right? So the mass of the sun actually changes the curvature of space. And that's actually what explains, why, light can bend, for example. You can actually kind of see a little bit the light that's coming from behind a planet. And that's because the mass of the planet bends space in a way such that the light can actually, get from behind the planet to in front of you. Now, I know I'm doing a terrible job of explaining this. It really, kind of doesn't matter here. The main point is this: relativity theory, which all, mainstream, I should say, physicists accept, is simply not compatible with old school materialism. According to materialism, space is just a void. It's just like, empty space. There's nothing there. But it's not like that. It's a weird kind of material that curves and flexes and expands and all these weird things. It twists. That's a crazy one. I'm not going to get into that. Light itself and time itself can curve. Time goes faster and slower depending on where you are next to a big mass, right? So if you're closer to one, time will go by faster than if you are really far away from one. Sorry, let me put that in a better way. If you are traveling really close to the speed of light, you will age slower. That's one way to put it. So space, the void, is not what the materialist said it was. That looks bad for materialism. I'll give you one more, and it's hard to talk about quantum mechanics. It really is. But let me just say this: the smallest particles that we know exist behave in utterly erratic ways. They have gappy existences, right? That means that they'll be in one place and they'll jump to another place without existing anywhere in between. Did you catch that? They just disappear and reappear somewhere else instantly. Nothing ever works that way, right? If you just imagine teleportation, that's what quantum particles do. They just disappear in one spot and show up somewhere else. There's all kinds of other things we can say here. They are entangled sometimes. It's called quantum entanglement, and I won't even get into that. But the basic idea here is that material things, as described by the materialists, are supposed to just be atoms and compounds made out of atoms. At no point did they mention anything even near quantum particles and how weird they behave. So the picture that the materialists have presented us with, it just doesn't seem to be accurate. The more we discover about how reality works, what it's really like, the materialist picture just doesn't look plausible anymore. They've never been able to explain consciousness, at least not satisfactorily. The views that they do put forward eventually get refuted or, outmoded. And what they do say about reality, for example, the way that the void is and the way material objects are, those have, seem to be disproven by contemporary physics. And so here is basically the point. Even if dualism doesn't seem to survive rational analysis, and I think most of those arguments for dualism fail, or all of them fail, and all the attempted save, all the ways that people have attempted to save the soul against the mind-body problem, I think all of those fail. Despite all of that, materialism has also failed. So it might be better to suspend judgment on this. It's not clear that we know, given the current set of arguments, that they're either true or false. It seems maybe that they're actually both false.